welcome to class today. It's a great pleasure to have Mohnish Pabrai here today. He's a very successful value investor and was inspired by Warren Buffett. Indeed, he had actually lunch with Warren Buffett a while ago, and they have this celebrity or this charity auction where you can, and that's how he was well influenced by Warren Buffett. His performance has been exceptional. I think starting in 1999 to today, $100,000 would have grown to 1.1 million after fees and expenses, and that outperformed the S&P by 4.5% per year, which is a very impressive performance, especially for value in the last decade. Before being an asset manager, Pabrai was tech entrepreneur, and he won as well an award from KPMG, Illinois, for his entrepreneurship. He has been quoted very widely in the media. He's very active on social media, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you today and to learn from you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. So it's a pleasure and honor to be with all of you. And I just have a few kind of opening remarks, and then I'm probably more interested in what you want to talk about. So then we can go to Q&A after that. So some of you, or maybe all of you, read Buffett's letter that came out on Saturday. Maybe show of hands. People who read it. Some of you started. That's good. Progress. Yeah, it was a pretty short letter, and God, Google can take you to the letter, so that's good. And I just wanted to highlight 2 or 3 comments he made in the letter, and so I'll just read you Buffett's words because he's a lot more eloquent than I can ever be. So he says, "Over the years, I have made many mistakes. Consequently, our extensive collection of businesses currently consists of a few enterprises that have truly extraordinary economics, many that enjoy very good economic characteristics, and a large group that are marginal." Then, going to another section on the same page. "At this point, a report card for me is appropriate. In 58 years of Berkshire management, most of my capital allocation decisions have been no better than so-so. Our satisfactory results have been the product of about a dozen truly good decisions that would be about 1 every 5 years. And a sometimes forgotten advantage that favors long-term investors such as Berkshire." So, this is arguably probably the best investor who's ever been around. And he says he's just done so-so. His record is exceptional. If you look at over the last 58 years, he's compounded at about 20% a year. And it's about, versus the S&P, it's like, 33.7 million% up versus, a few tens of thousands up, maybe 24,000% for the S&P. So it's a very significant delta. Once you get even small percentages above the S&P, the aggregates line up. So I was thinking about, like him saying that the 12 decisions he's made, and one of the things I would recommend to all of you is there's a website. Oh, do we have a marker? There's a website called buffett.cnbc.com. It's actually hosted by CNBC. And so that's a good website to go to. So what Buffett did a few years back is he posted all the videos of all his annual meetings, I think going back from the mid-90s to today, and they're all on that website, and they've got annotations and so on. And I actually spent about, I think, maybe 7 or 8 months. I still do. I have a waterproof Bluetooth speaker in my shower. And basically, I just listened to different podcasts, whatever, but for about 7 or 8 months, I went through all the meetings while I was shaving and showering. And I went through it twice, actually, because it was, and I'm sure if I went through it again, I would learn even more. So it's a great resource. The price is right. It's free. And you might enjoy that. I think there's a lot to learn from those archives, because each meeting is about 5 or 6 hours, and there's a lot of jokes and whatever else going on, which is fun. But he was talking about the dozen or so great decisions that have set Berkshire apart. And if you look at Berkshire Hathaway over the last 58 years, they've probably acquired whole businesses, maybe around 80 whole businesses over that period of time. And they've bought and sold probably well over 100 stocks, which would be very little, which would be like less than 2 a year. Maybe it's 125 or 150, somewhere in that range. It's maybe 2 or 3 a year. And with all of that mess of, let's say, investments in north of 200 businesses, wholly or partially owned, there's only a dozen that he points to that he thinks are responsible for setting Berkshire apart. So I tried to come up with the list of the 12 based on everything I can think of, what he said in the past, and so on. And I don't know whether this list is accurate, but I'll put it up, and it may be off by a couple of names, but I think it's pretty close. So the first name is, he says, the headhunting fee paid to hire Ajit Jain. There's Berkshire Hathaway Energy. There's the Burlington Northern Railway. And these are not in a particular order. They could be more important up and down. Geico. And then we have See's Candy. And then we have Washington Post. We have Cap Cities, ABC. And then Coke, Amex, and let me just see what I'm missing here. Yeah, so Bank of America and National Indemnity, which was the first insurance company he bought. And so you look at this list, and then you look at this very astute investor who's the best that we've been able to produce as humans. And you basically end up with something like, my estimate is that out of the 80 or so businesses that they acquired whole, at least half were just outright mistakes, in the sense that they've either disappeared or their annualized returns that they've generated for Berkshire since they've been bought, or even in the first 10 years after buying them, was well below the S&P and so on. And on the marketable securities side, it's somewhat similar. I would say that probably at least half are, kind of okay. Now, the good news with the investing business is it's a very forgiving business. And there was a very good investor in India who passed away recently, Rakesh Jhunjhunwala. Some of you may have heard of him. And Rakesh actually never managed money as a profession. He just managed his own capital. And he started with basically, I would say, less than a couple of $100. And he died pretty young. He was 62 when he passed away. So didn't have more than 4 decades of compounding. And in that 4 decades, with never collecting fees or outside capital or anything, he passed away. He had about 7 billion or so. And half of that 7 billion was one company, which is a publicly listed company in India called Titan Industries. And Rakesh had put about 4% of the total assets he had about maybe 27 or 28 years ago into Titan. and he just left it there. And he had a kind of a split brain in the sense that he was a hyperactive trader. Many times he was in and out of positions, in a few minutes or few hours. But at the same time, there were a few companies that he just kept forever. And so if you think about someone like Rakesh, 96% of the portfolio could have gone to zero. And if he just never touched Titan, he'd still have $3.5 billion. And so it really didn't matter what happened with the other 96%, as long as he didn't touch Titan. And I think with Berkshire, it's really similar. The reason why these businesses have worked out so well, they're businesses with great fundamentals and they have high returns on equity, is that Buffett has held them for a very long period of time. And it's the long-term compounding of a great business that has delivered these great results. And so, I think you guys have probably what I think is the largest size investment fund being managed by students anywhere that I ever heard of. But we are at UT Austin, this is not a poor school by any means. So that's pretty good place to be. But I think one of the dilemmas that probably comes up depending on the rules and kind of setup you have for managing those funds is that in most cases there isn't a long enough time horizon. And so really when we make investments, the payoffs may come in 10, 20, 30 years. And you may be done with managing the fund in 2 years or less. So that is a little bit of a bummer in terms of, but hopefully you're making investments which are longer term. And maybe I can ask you a question. What happens to the positions when you guys graduate? What happens? Maybe one of you can. Where's the mic? Can we just pass the mic to you so we can?
Direct holding was roll over in for the next year. And so we inherited the direct holdings from your acquirers to us.
Okay. And have you touched those holdings?
Our group has not yet.
What's the plan?
We will eventually start selling some.
There was some heavy-duty horsepower that went into buying those positions. And I guess we don't have as much respect for the past horsepower because the present horsepower is better than the past horsepower. But that's a somewhat difficult situation because the fund managers have changed effectively. And so the number one skill set that is important for investing is patience. There's an investor I admire a lot. His name is Chuck Akre. Some of you may have heard of him. And Chuck is now 80 years old and he manages about, 14, 15 billion out of a one traffic light town in Virginia, Middleburg. And I wanted to connect with Chuck and I didn't know him, so I just wrote him a cold letter last year, telling him that I'd love to meet him and love to visit the one traffic lights, town and so on. And he responded, and then I made the trip to Middleburg and met with Chuck. And Chuck's basic kind of approach, and I think if you go on YouTube or Google, he's got this approach which he calls the three-legged stool of investing. And he only does one kind of investing. He doesn't, I would say someone like Buffett or Charlie Munger is a Swiss Army knife. They're doing, 14 different things and they're really good at all of them. Chuck claims that he's a very slow learner and he only does one thing. So he looks for businesses where, first of all, the businesses have great economics. They generate very high returns on equity. The second is that they have a very long runway. So they can take those cash flows that are coming out and redeploy into these high, wonderful economic businesses. And the third is extremely high integrity management with skin in the game. So those are the three legs of his stool. And so whenever they look at any business, they just look at these three factors. And it's worked out really well. I mean, they've delivered well above the S&P and so on. So pretty straightforward process. And it's not very difficult to look at a business and look at the history and see what the returns on equity have been over time. And of course, you want high returns on equity without the use of leverage, because that's the kind of hallmark of a great business. And so if you can identify those, and of course, it's very similar to what Warren and Charlie look for, but the whole idea of looking into the future and trying to extrapolate what a business looks like 10 years or 20 years or 30 years from now is a very difficult exercise. We've got creative destruction and we've got things coming from left field. And I remember that when I was living in California and used to fly in and out of LAX many years back, there was a really good parking operator called Wally Park near the airport. And Wally Park had really good service. So first of all, what they had done in their parking lot is that they had put these leather dividers between each car so that your car couldn't get dinged. So once you park, basically, any doors opening, whatever, you would never get dinged. And the second is they just ran a very high frequency of shuttles back and forth. So it was just always really good service that, you park there. It was very quick to get to the airport, very quick to get picked up. And I used to think, this is probably going back, maybe 15, 20 years, that Wally Park is the kind of business that looks bulletproof. They have high customer service, and none of their competitors around ever cloned or copied the leather dividers. I looked at all of them. None of them ever did that, and they never even bothered with the frequency of the shuttles and all of that. So I said, these guys have been around for so many decades, and it's great. And if the business ever comes up for sale, I should think about buying it if it is available at a reasonable price. And these were just thoughts in my head. And then next thing you know is you have Uber. And then people aren't parking at the airport. I wasn't driving to the airport anymore. And so you just have things come from left field, which are not on your radar at all. You just don't think that there's anything that would create a distortion. And but that's the nature of capitalism with the creative destruction. So with that, I'm probably more interested in what you have on your minds and what you'd like to talk about. So we can go from there and just take the mic, or you can come up to the mic, whatever you prefer.
Thank you for being here. Could you kind of talk about how you developed your investment philosophy, if that's still changing, if you're still growing into it?
Sure. Well, I really don't have anything homegrown in terms of investment philosophy. Everything is cloned and copied from someone. They've been cloned and copied from Buffett and Munger and Graham and Chuck Akre and a zillion other people. And so the good news about the value investing community, starting with Ben Graham, was that there's a culture of sharing the knowledge and helping next generation to learn and grow and so on. And so I didn't go to business school, and I just learned investing from reading initially Warren Buffett's biographies, then the Berkshire letters, then the Buffett partnership letters, and then Charlie Munger and all of that, and Graham and so on. So that's basically the way I went about it and self-educated myself. And then I started to make investments. So Buffett has a quote. He says that I'm a better investor because I'm a businessman, and I'm a better businessman because I'm an investor. There's an interplay between running a business and running a portfolio. And one of the things that attracted me a lot to Warren Buffett was that when I was running my IT business, basically probably 3 or 4 or 5% of my time used to go in kind of figuring out strategy and direction. And every 2 or 3 years, I had to tweak that because the market had changed. And probably 80-90% of time went in all the blocking and tackling and the heavy lifting of making it happen and getting the people and all of that. And I always liked the 3 or 4% time a lot better than the 80-90% of blocking and tackling. And one of the kind of moments of epiphany that came to me when I actually accidentally heard about Buffett, and I read into how he invests, was that he had converted that 4% time to 80%. So you're using basically the same brain cells, and you're using the same kind of mental models in effect, because basically if I'm looking at an expansion of my business into a new area, I'm looking at the economics and what kind of risk I'm going to take and what are likely rewards and so on, which are very similar to what you're looking at in investing. And so to me, that was just very attractive to be able to take the 4% to 80% or 90%. And so I started to take my foot off the being an entrepreneur to being an investor, where I think in 94, there was a small sale of a portion of my business, and after taxes, I got left with about $1 million. And it's the first time I had any money in my account because I had bootstrapped the business with credit cards and so on. And I didn't really need the money, so I started to invest it using what I had learned till then about Buffett's approach. And in about 5 years, that million had become about 13 million. So I said, well done, Mohnish, that's pretty good. And I was not spending that much time, and I was spending more time on my business, but I was getting less and less interested in the business and more interested in investing. And around 99, I made the switch. I basically left the company, found a CEO, and then the Pabrai fund started really as a hobby with a few friends that wanted me to manage their money, and then kind of went from there. So, other questions?
I had a question regarding, I know there's been a lot of change happening of late with the stoppage or the reduction of the quantitative easing, and perhaps there is a move back to value, but with all the technological changes which are happening. So are there any themes you are thinking about for the next couple of decades which might be coming in from the left field, which we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think I tend not to think much at all about anything macro and anything the Fed is doing or anything anyone says about interest rates and any of that. To me, all of that is kind of in the noise level. And I've always felt that whether the prime rate is 3% or 7% shouldn't make much difference to what I'm doing in terms of investments and so on. And so basically the idea is that we want to look for no-brainers. We want to look for things where there is a very large gap between price and value. We want to look for things where the returns on equity are very high. We want to look for things where the runways are very long, just like, Chuck's three-legged stool, right? And one of the difficulties that comes up in the US markets is that it's a very heavily picked over market. So we have more hedge funds than stocks. That's a problem. We have more hedge funds, we have more mutual funds than stocks by some significant margin. And just right there, which means that you've got, in effect, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of some really smart people picking over a number of businesses. And so to be able to get a differentiated view versus that August group is not easy, which is why, we go back to what Buffett said about, a so-so record. He has a more difficult time because, for example, when a company is offered for sale as a whole company purchase, usually the seller controls the timing to make it a very attractive time for the seller where the business is going on the up and up. And usually sellers will, in the US, demand a premium because there's, I haven't even talked about the private equity funds. We got thousands of those as well. So you have a lot of competition for wholly owned businesses. You've got a lot of competition for publicly traded businesses and everything in between. And so when Buffett is presented an opportunity to buy a business, it may have some great qualities, but may also have some warts. And he's got very little time and he's got a lot of money and he has to make a decision. Well, do I just say no? Do I go for it because we're earning 2% elsewhere? And what do we do, right? So those are not easy decisions to make, especially when you've got something like 2 or 3 billion coming in every month in cash flows for Omaha to deploy. And my answer to that nowadays is to not spend much time looking at North American businesses. I found that I started making trips to Turkey about 5 years ago, and I'm going there again in about 2 weeks, and I found that it was a very hated, extremely mispriced market with a lot of crazy macro situations going on, and I couldn't even get some of my best friends to look at some of the businesses. And so Turkey has, north of 80% inflation, and the currency loses a lot of value every year, and so on. But we've had some good success investing there. So it's a $1 trillion economy, and the total amount that all foreign investors have in Turkey is like 20 billion. And we have about 200 million in Turkey, which is like 1%. It wasn't 1%. We didn't put 200 million in, we put much less than that. And it went up. But the thing is that I found very crazy mispricing. And I found that even with all the headwinds, we were not going to probably have a problem. And so what I did in Turkey is I said, okay, let's only look at businesses which don't have earnings in lira. They should have earnings in euros or dollars, or they should have assets that have an international value. So in a way, what I was looking for is because the baby got thrown out of the bathwater, right? Nobody wants to go there because it's kind of toxic. They think it's toxic. But I said, if I look at businesses where we don't have any currency issues, so for example, I don't have an investment in this, but there's a fruit juice manufacturer in Turkey, I'm just giving you an example, where 98% of the revenue is exports into the European Union. And Turkey is part of the European Common Market where they can export and import from Europe with no duties or tariffs. It's free trade. And so the more the lira collapses, the lower their cost in euros. And since they're exporting, they get operating leverage. So their earnings in euros keep going up, even if they don't grow, because of this dynamic, right? And so as long as this craziness continues, they would end up doing pretty well. But because everyone left, everything got mispriced. So I found some extremely crazily mispriced businesses. So I said, okay, we've got a whole market that's mispriced. What I'll do is I won't go after the cheapest ones, which used to be the old Mohnish. After a few decades, you learn. I said, I'll go after very high quality businesses. And I ended up in one case with an extremely high quality business, which was just extremely mispriced. So we bought into this operator of warehouses. It's the largest warehouse operator in Turkey. They're kind of like a landlord. And I remember the day I went to meet them in 2019 for the first time. My friend in Turkey who I had told, listen, I just want to go meet all the companies that you already have an investment in. So don't take me to companies you have not invested in. I wanted like one layer of protection to start with. And so he was telling me, Mohnish, the company has a market cap of $16 million, 1/6. And the liquidation value is probably like 600 to 800 million. So I said, is it a fraud? Because that's the only reason we'd have such crazy pricing. He said, no, it's not a fraud. I own it in my portfolio. And I said, it's sitting at 2% of liquidation value. He said, yeah, a lot of things in Turkey are mispriced. Before that, the previous year, the first company I visited in Turkey, when I had again made the trip and I told him I want to visit companies in this portfolio, we were going to visit one of the largest banks in Turkey. And so he tells me, Mohnish, the PE is 0.1. Okay, not 1, which means you are buying a company at 1 time's earnings. You would be buying the bank at 1 month's earnings. Okay, I think my trips to Turkey are the most orgasmic trips. The food is great, the weather is great, the company is great, and the companies are great to visit. So as we're walking over to go visit this PE of 0.1, my only time in my life I visited a 0.1 PE company, I asked my friend, is there hair on it? He said, yeah, there's a little bit of hair on it. I said, can you tell me what hair it has on it? He said, well, so the bank was Halkbank, and Halkbank is one of the largest banks in Turkey. He said, well, the chairman of the company decided to ignore this UN embargo and sanctions against Iran, with the fund transfers and all, and he was doing en masse, permitting all kinds of transfers to take place. And the US got wind of that. And the CFO of the bank had made a personal trip to the US where he was going to go to Disney World with his family. And when he landed at JFK, the feds picked him up and they sent him straight to Rikers prison. And the family, I don't think, continued on to Disney World without him. They went back to Istanbul. And so he was locked up in Rikers prison. And then Erdogan is calling Trump to try to get the guy released. And Trump is telling his buddy Erdogan that it's the state of New York, and it's the state of New York's attorney general that's going after this. The federal government has no authority. So he's saying, I can't even do anything. I don't have any power. So he was trying to explain to Erdogan how the president of the United States has no power to get one guy out of prison, And so when all of this hit the newspapers, and the US Federal Reserve was thinking about actions where they would just kibosh them. They would take them out of the SWIFT system and take them out of everything. The stock goes to the PE of 0.1. And I'm getting this story as we're going up the elevator to see the company. And very high quality, honorable people, I think that CFO had nothing to do with any of this. They just needed somebody to do that. And so I told my friend after that meeting that I can deal with hair, but not so much hair. This is too much. Can we just take it down 1 or 2 levels? Let's not do the 0.1 and 0.2 Ps. Let's move up to the PE of 1s. I think the PE of 1s is I can deal with that. And so then we were, the next year we were going to see this, this company Reysas. And this time I could find no hair on it. I could find nothing wrong with it. The father and son who ran it, they seemed like really high quality people. None of it made any sense. Their warehouses, which are just, works of art, they're really beautiful. 12 million square feet in very prime areas in Turkey, 99% leased, 10-year inflation index leases, a lot of the leases in dollars and euros. Amazon, IKEA, Carrefour, Mercedes, DuPont, these are the tenants, And so, any which way I looked at it, I couldn't find anything wrong with it. Then I'm looking at the market cap at 16 million, and I'm going to say, what can I invest, I was managing like 600 million or something. I said, what are we going to do with this? So anyway, I started buying, and I said, we can buy whatever we can get. And I was surprised that for $7 or $8 million, we got 1/3 of the company. Nobody's interested. And I remember we got a block of like 5% of the company from Templeton funds. And some guy at Templeton in New York probably issued some order saying exit Turkey. There was no analysis or anything done about what they own. They just got a blanket order that we are nuking all our positions in the country. And I'm saying, bring it on. You want to give me and John Templeton would be turning in his grave with, his firm is selling at 2% of liquidation value. And that wasn't the best part about Reysas. The best part about Reysas was that when I met the father and son, they told me that their investment philosophy is that they do not want to put money out if they cannot get it back in 2 or 3 years in dollars or euros. So basically, not only did they have the warehouses, they had the largest freight train network in Turkey. So the railways are owned by the government. Government owns the track and they own the locomotives. But the rail cars, the freight rail cars, those can be privately owned, and they're the largest operator of those, which is a great business. They have the largest truck fleet in Turkey. I think they got like 2,000 trucks. They have, the largest forklift rental business, vehicle inspections. Every business I looked at that they had very favorable economics. And it was interesting. The father had never been to college. If I asked him, what is ROE, ROI, IRR, he would have no idea what I'm talking about. But he understands, I put $1 out, I want it back in 2 years. That's what he understands. And that was the bar by which they invested. So because they had this high bar, they always ended up in great businesses. All their businesses were like recurring revenue, very good visibility deep into the future, and so on. So I said, an asset is worth 700 or 800 million. The cash flows are being redeployed at 25 to 35%. Where do I sign? And if they never increase the value of the business, we have a 50x or a 30x. Because by the time I finished buying it, it moved up a little bit. So we would have 3% liquidation value. And so that 16 million market cap now is more than 300 or 350 million. So it's moved up a bit. But their liquidation value is now $1.5 billion or so. It may be more because a lot of the assets I'm not able to value. I'm just valuing the real estate. I'm ignoring the rest of it. And I'm not valuing the engine that redeploys. The engine that redeploys is the most valuable piece of the whole puzzle. And so I think that if I were you guys looking at the fund and so on, I would do what Charlie Munger recommends, which is you go fishing where the fish are. And some of these places can be uncomfortable, and some of these will take some time to get your arms around. And it took me now I think, this would be my 5th year looking at Turkey. So what I realized is that I understood everything about the fear and all the foreign investors exiting and all of that. And I realized that there were a few businesses, probably, I can think of at least 4 or 5, maybe more, maybe close to 10, where when I met these management teams, they had been US Ivy League educated, MBAs from Cornell or Harvard or Columbia, very high quality people that I met, very high integrity, and very high quality business that they were running. But nobody was interested because of the stigma of where it was located. There's an airport operator in Turkey, which is the other investment we have. Operating airports can be a good business if you don't overpay. In the US, in the continental 48 states, all the airports used to be government owned. And so we don't have the phenomena of this, private operators, but LaGuardia now is the only one. LaGuardia used to be, an armpit of the US as far as airports go. And now it's a spectacular airport. They actually gave it to a private operator, and it's become a great airport. But in other parts of the world, private airports are much more prevalent. But still, out of something like, I would say, more than 10,000 airports around, only about 300 are private. So it's a very small number. But that number will grow. The number of airports coming up in Africa and Asia will go up a lot. And a lot of them will end up in private hands because it's a win-win for everyone. So this airport operator, which is based in Istanbul, they operate 15 airports, 8 of which are outside Turkey. But they still get the stigma of Turkey. And even the airports within Turkey, all their contracted revenues and everything is in euros. Nothing is in lira. So it's a completely insulated. And in Turkey, their costs are in lira. The people and the labor and employees and all that is all in lira. So all the devaluations and everything actually give them tailwinds. And all the airports, the ones that are private in the world, they operate on what they call BOT, build, operate, transfer. So typically these concessions might be 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, but when they expire, they go back to the government or they get renewed with another pound of flesh extracted by the government and so on. But in the middle of COVID, TAV Airports acquired an airport in Kazakhstan, in Almaty, outright. It's the only airport I know of, significant airport around the world, which is completely privately owned forever. And this deal happened when there were no planes flying. So the entire all-in cost of that deal was $650 million, most of it financed at 3 or 4% over a very long period of time, a fixed rate. And this airport in a few years will be producing about something north of $150 million or more in cash flows. And those cash flows will be growing at about 5 or 7% a year, as far as the eye can see, because Kazakhstan actually is a very wealthy country with a lot of oil. And so anyway, we own little over 5% of the airport. But just the Almaty airport alone, in my opinion, is worth several $1 billion. And the market cap of the company was like 700 or 800 million. And I'm not counting the other 14 airports. And I'm not counting their other subsidiaries. They have a whole bunch of other subsidiaries. And so basically, like this time when I'm going to Turkey, I'm going to be visiting a bunch of businesses that I haven't met before. And I know people are not interested, which is great. We'll hopefully not go to the 0.1 Ps. We'll try to keep it at the 1 P. 1 P is a good place to be. So anyway, next question.
How do you decide when to sell?
Oh. So I think Phil Fisher has a quote. He says that, and that's a great book if you haven't read it, Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits. It's a really good book. But he has a quote that if the job is done right, every sell decision is a mistake. And so this took me a long time to figure out, a few decades. And I've made a gazillion selling mistakes. I mean, it's just such a long list. Buffett thinks his list is long. My list is even longer. So ideally, you want to be like Chuck Akre. They run a mutual fund. And you know how the typical mutual fund has like 70, 80% annual turnover. The Akre fund is 1% annual turnover. And that 1% I think is mostly coming because they have some redemptions or whatever, people going in and out of the funds, forcing them to sell something. But basically, ideally what we want to be doing is we want to be very patient. We want to be, buying businesses that have favorable economics, that have long runways. And yeah, I mean, we can have a very high error rate and still do okay. So when you are absolutely convinced that you have made a mistake, where either you misunderstood the moat, or you misunderstood the runway, or you misunderstood what the future of the business would look like, then those may become candidates for sales. But I think that selling is very hard. I think selling is much harder than buying. And so that's just the nature of investing. But because it's such a forgiving business, we can be okay on the selling. We can be, sloppy on the selling and still be okay, as long as we keep the crown jewels intact. So.
You mentioned that there are fewer opportunities in the US, and therefore you go to Turkey or other markets abroad. What would be your suggestion for the students, since our mandate is to invest in US securities, and they have now this week to think about the pitch? What would you suggest for them to do, how to generate ideas, how to evaluate a stock, if it's a good value stock or not?
Well, I feel sorry for them. It's a difficult job. Well, I would say that I don't know what all the restrictions are, but generally speaking, you will have more inefficiency in the smaller names. You could look, I would say, given the time horizons, some areas like merger arbitrage might be interesting. We have this Activision Microsoft deal, which has a pretty wide delta, and Buffett seems to think that delta is not justified. That might fit in your time frames. Before you leave, you can have an outcome on that, which is good. So I would look for, what I would do in that case is I would look for quirks and anomalies. And what I would do is I would zoom in on places and things like the Value Investors Club, and because those are a bunch of pretty high quality write-ups, and I would look at the ones that were in the US or North America and see which ones of those are theses that I would buy into, and kind of take it from there. So that's what I would do. I think the fact that you're running 20, 30 million is an advantage. That's a big advantage. So one of the things you could do is, are they allowed to go nano cap?
No.
What is the lowest cap they're allowed to do?
1 billion.
Oh, so sad. It's like the knife went in and then got turned. So try to stick to things that are under a couple of billion. I would take, other than something like a merger arbitrage like Activision or something, I would take the whole radar to be between 1 and 2 billion. And I would not look at these, Googles and all of that. I would just look at that space, and I'd be trying to see if I can find anomalies in that space. And that's what you would try to do. And how many positions minimum?
It's fairly 30 to 50 individual names.
30?
30 to 50.
They can't put it in one name?
No.
They can't? So Buffett hired 2 managers, Todd and Ted. And he told them, because they have like 15, 20 billion each now, he says, I don't care if you put it all in one name. So that was the third issue, is that you have a very wide number of names. After 5 years of going to Turkey and drilling down on all these businesses, I have 2 investments there. That's it. I just found 2 out of so many that, each trip I visited like 20 companies, and it's a market that's been clobbered, So even with all the clobbering and everything else, I still couldn't find that many, And so I think the US, there is opportunity. I think the thing that you would have to do is you would have to have a differentiated view on these businesses which have a high probability of playing out. And those are just difficult. There's a lot of smart people looking at things. But if you have an edge in some area and you can see things a little bit differently, then that edge can actually give you a big advantage. And so that can work out. Other questions? Yeah.
How do you think your background has with thinking from either entrepreneurship or technology? How do you think that's influenced different deal as investor your boss statement?
Well, I think what really helped me a lot was kind of accidental. It's kind of what I ended up as experiences during my childhood. So the human brain, so first of all, when we are born and the baby's coming out through the birth canal, which is very narrow, the brain is the most underdeveloped organ that a human infant has because the birth canal is just not wide enough. So the brain goes through, it's one of the fastest growing organs in the first 5 years of life. So massive amounts of growth in the brain and a long infancy for human kids. After the age of 10 or 11 till about 19 or 20, the brain is actually culling neuron connections. So it goes through a rapid increase in connections in the first 5 years, then it slows down, and then after that, it starts culling connections, and it's actually optimally set up at that window of time. That's the only window of time in our entire lives to specialize. And so if you are able to put a lot of time and energy into what eventually becomes your calling in life, you get a huge head start. And one of the problems we have as kind of modern humans is that in that period of time, our education system and society expects us to be generalists. So you are, sent to school and you have a set of subjects and you have a set of things you do. And really the ability to specialize is for the most part non-existent. It may happen a little bit when you're 17 or 18 and may happen a little bit when you enter college, but basically the window closes by the time the specialization starts. And we end up with some quirks, like you end up with people like Bill Gates, who like from the age of 11 or so went all in on computers and programming. So by the time he was 18 or 19, he had spent more than 10,000 hours coding. And a 40-year-old could not compete with a 25-year-old Bill Gates just because of that period of time where he completely specialized. With Warren Buffett, he bought his first stock when he was 11 or 12. He read every finance book in the Omaha Public Library before he was like 14 or 15. So, and his father was a stockbroker. He'd go to his office every weekend. So Warren got a lot of kind of expertise in investing very early in that window of time. And if we look at people like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and so on, and go back, you will see that a lot of the greats were able to, it used to be, we still have that situation in Germany where they start separating out the kids when they're like 13 or 14, where if you're going to go work in a factory, you actually start doing apprenticeships and all of that in factories in Germany when you're 13 or 14. And so Germany is interesting, where it's a manufacturing powerhouse with some of the highest labor costs in the world. So China hasn't been able to uproot German manufacturing because of the quality of the workforce. And the quality of the workforce is that high in Germany because they specialize that early. And so in my case, what happened is my father was an entrepreneur, but he kind of like clockwork, every like 3 or 4 years, he went out of business, whatever he was doing. He was always really good at starting businesses, identifying opportunities, but he was always undercapitalized, didn't have enough money. And when the business was doing well, he just, pushed on all cylinders, maxed the leverage, maxed everything he could. And then the first headwinds that showed up would destroy the company. And then my parents they didn't save. So we would go from feast to famine quite regularly. So when I was around, after I was 11 or 12, my brother and my father would sit down with us in the evening and we'd have to figure out how to make the business last for one more day. All the walls are caving in, all the creditors are coming in. It's just, it's collapsing, and it's a very kind of intense time. And all of that is affecting, like we don't have money for rent, we don't have money for groceries, all of that. So we'd make it through one day. And then the next night was, how do you make it survive one more day? And when I was like 15 or 16, I used to go on sales calls with my dad. And I never realized that any of these things with my, the neurons and all of that, that I think I finished several MBAs before I was 18. And so I can actually look at businesses and figure them out pretty quickly, probably because of a lot of experience and thinking about business in those years. So even though I was working, going to generalist schools and all of that, there was a decent amount of time that went into all of these things. So later, when I actually heard about Buffett and started reading, a lot of things actually came to me pretty easily because I had looked at so many issues with these companies and businesses. I also learned from my dad how to start businesses with nothing. And so that was a great gift I got from him, which helped me get my first business off the ground because I didn't have any money when I was doing that. And so I think that experience helped me a lot. Then when I started running my business, obviously there was more direct experience I got. And then when I, actually got a proper framework from Buffett and Munger and so on, then that just overlaid everything else and it worked out. So actually for me, I'm just accidentally right place at the right time and pretty lucky, I would say. So it worked out well. Yeah.
If we could get your thoughts on knowing how much you understand about Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett's style of investing, about their foray into Occidental, because for the longest time they had avoided materials and very cyclical commodities, and then entering into Occidental, and they keep ramping up their stakes. What do you think of that as an investment?
Yeah, so I think both of them have been investors in oil and gas for a very long time. Munger made a investment in what was eventually one of his biggest mistakes because he didn't buy enough Belridge oil in 1977. So that's like 46 years back. So they've and Charlie will tell me things. I have a good friendship with Charlie. I usually see him 4 or 5 times a year for dinner, and I used to play a lot of bridge with him. Sometimes I'd be at his place and he'd tell me, and he's living in, Hancock Park in LA. He says that we are sitting on top of an oil field, And so then he explained to me how that whole area actually was an oil field, but then because so many humans moved in and the real estate prices became more attractive to build homes and sell the real estate that way than to drill for oil, that LA basically developed without really extracting the oil, so to speak. So it still sits there. One time I was talking to him and he mentioned that he would love to have a investment in Exxon and be able to get a commitment from the management that they would do no more CapEx and they would simply run all the fields with the cash flows going to the shareholders. And he had calculated it'd be a tremendous investment. And of course, oil companies don't think that way. But Oxy thinks that way. So I think the Oxy investment, if you study Occidental, what you'll find is they don't really have exploration going on. So if we look at the whole fracking business and the Permian Basin and all of that, basically when you drill a well, you've got a 90+% shot of what's going to come out. I mean, the probabilities are really high. And it's not like what used to be conventional oil. So here you've got very definitive metrics going on. And so Oxy basically has almost no speculative drilling going on. And so in effect, it looks like a CD. they're clipping the coupons. And what Oxy is doing is they have a huge gusher of cash flows coming out. And that huge gusher of cash flows is only going into buybacks and dividends. So it's all being pumped out to shareholders. And he loves that. And then they made an investment in Chevron. I think the reason they made the investment in Chevron is also Chevron has a very large position in the Permian Basin. And if Oxy was large enough, they wouldn't have gone to Chevron. Just like he bought all the US airlines, a while back he bought all the, because he couldn't make one bet because the size of the capital is so large. He was forced, kind of like you guys are forced, when you find one airline, you got to buy all of them because you have 30 positions, to put to work. So I think the Chevron bet is heavily a bet based on this non-exploration risk. And, the oil business lately, and of course, UT Austin knows this really well with the $8 billion that's coming out every year into the endowment. People think Harvard has the biggest endowment, but they don't really understand. We are the biggest endowment here. And you've got, I haven't seen a business school building as good as this one. Long live the oil fields. So I think the bet with Chevron and Oxy is a coupon clipping bet. And so I think Buffett looked at what US Treasuries are paying him, and he doesn't want downside. So he looked at Oxy as US Treasuries on steroids. And I think that's why he went with that bet. So, other questions?
So you talked about the three-legged stool and one of those legs being the management. And I'm just curious what's your process, how do you go about analyzing the quality of the management?
Buffett and Munger have spoken quite a bit about this. They say that what you should do is don't listen to what they're saying. Just look at the track record. So if you have a long enough history of the business with the same manager, you will be able to tell whether they underpromised and over-delivered, or whether they overpromised and under-delivered, whether they have skin in the game or they don't have skin in the game, whether their interests are aligned with yours or not, and how they think about it. And you can come to some judgment about humans based on the track record. And you should completely ignore the projections and what they're saying will happen in the future. CEOs are optimists, so they're not trying to be deceitful in most cases. They just see things from rose-colored glasses. But I think if you just look at the history of the business, then I think that can tell you a lot. Like the business in Turkey, Reysas, when they IPO'd, they took in 40 million of capital. And then recently they did a rights issue and they picked up another 10 million. So 50 million is the total amount that went into that company. They've never issued dividends because they've been reinvesting. And we have something like $1.5 billion or more of value in not that many years, probably less than 15 years or something. And so that's a remarkable record. I can look at that history. And when I look at, last few years, when I look at the decisions they've made, I can't point to anything that I would disagree with. They've been very sound decisions. So I just look at the past, and I think the past is very easy to look at because we've got a lot of data. So I had made an investment in 2012, and I think this is one of the larger mistakes I made, just because I should have held on, and I didn't hold on long enough. So in 2012, I invested in Fiat Chrysler automobiles. I always hated the auto business. The auto business just badly sucks. You have very high capex, you have unions, you have finicky customer tastes, you have 4 years it takes to engineer and bring a car to market, and then people may not like the shape or may not like various things about it, and that could fail. It would cost you, hundreds of millions or billions to engineer a car and may or may not work. So it's just on every front, it's just terrible. And especially in North America, Detroit used to be one of the worst places to build a car. You had very high labor costs and unions and all these different things going on, very kind of calcified management. But what I had noticed was that during the financial crisis, GM and Chrysler went through near-that experiences. And the auto task force that was headed by Steve Ratner basically were put in place in Washington, D.C. to re-engineer these companies and bring them back to life. And I was reading when I was studying Fiat Chrysler, I was reading Steve Ratner's book about the whole experience of doing that. And he was talking about one time that there are like 4 or 5 members of the task force that had come up with what they wanted the new union contract to be. So they had, without talking to the union, they had come up with a new set of, what workers would get paid and all of that, which was very widely off from the way it was. So they had a meeting with the UAW, and they sat down with the UAW at like 2 in the afternoon or something, and they told the UAW, this is your new contract, and please sign on the last page and give it back to us. So the UAW said, you don't understand how this works. You are giving us something, that's fine, we'll take it. In a few weeks, we'll come back to you, and we can just see from page 1, we're not going to accept 90% of this. So we're not going to deal with this, and you don't really understand how unions worked. So Steve Ratner tells him that our plane leaves at 5 o'clock. He said that if I don't have a signed contract without a comma change by 5 o'clock, I shut all the lights down in the city tomorrow, and all your jobs are gone. I don't particularly care if they're the business or not. You're not dealing with some GM or Chrysler management. The UAW signed at 4:45 with no changes. Never ever in the history of Detroit did that happen. So then I went to Google and pulled up the contract that they signed, which was available, and I read it. And I looked at the previous contract. They had knocked something like 70-80% off the labor cost, and they took out ability to fire anyone at will, all these things. They just took out all kinds of things that had been bargained by the UAW over decades, because they could always strike. They would strike in one plant that made transmissions, and that would shut down the whole, your whole supply chain and everything. You couldn't produce a single car. And so I realized when I was looking at this thing in 2012 that Detroit had actually gone. So the reason auto manufacturing went to Detroit to begin with, going back to the time of Henry Ford and so on, is that area of the planet has tremendous iron ore deposits. It has tremendous coal deposits. We have a huge iron and steel industry, and we have the Great Lakes, which allow movement of all those goods by water, and the Erie Canal and so on. So basically you had that entire footprint around the Great Lakes where you could bring in all the different factors of production, you could ship out. It was very efficient. And that's why Detroit rose, because it had all those advantages. And basically those advantages have come back. But the market did not recognize. The market thought autos are terrible and unions are terrible, and nobody really was paying attention that everything had changed. And then when I was looking at Fiat Chrysler in 2012, they had hired a superstar manager, Sergio Marchionne. And so Sergio architected the acquisition of Chrysler by Fiat, which was a minnow swallowing a whale, and did that acquisition. And when I was looking at it in 2012, the market cap of Fiat Chrysler was $5 billion. The revenues were $140 billion. So we were back in Istanbul, man. In North America, we were back in Istanbul. It was the bazaar, the grand bazaar, and nobody was interested. We were at 4% of sales. But not only we were at 4% of sales, just two of their franchises. So if I just, they had a lot of assets in the company. But if I just looked at two of their franchises, their Ram franchise and their Jeep franchise, just to look into. So on the Ram franchise side, they have this law in the US where imported trucks cannot come in, light duty trucks cannot come in. I forget, it's a chicken tax or something. There's some very old law. So basically, even when Toyota wanted to enter the truck market in the US, they had to start building trucks in Texas. Otherwise, they couldn't. So basically, the light truck market, and Texas is the truck capital of the US. I think 50% sales are trucks. Is basically three players, all North American players. And even Toyota has not been able to make much of a dent because the brand loyalties with those trucks is very high, and they make $10,000 a truck. It's a very profitable. So if you just extrapolated, the number of trucks sold every year and the 10,000 per truck, you would make like, 3-4 billion a year just in trucks. And then the Jeep franchise, which was the other one, there were three franchises: the truck franchise, the Jeep franchise, and the minivans. These three were dominant for Chrysler. And the three of them together were coming up to like 10 billion in cash flows. Now they had a bunch of other stuff that was bleeding, which these new contracts allowed them to kibosh, right? So, but besides this, they had Alfa Romeo, Maserati, and most importantly, which I didn't pay much attention to, 80% of Ferrari was sitting inside Fiat Chrysler. And so I put $60 million into Fiat Chrysler, 10% of the fund, in 2012. And I thought that we'd probably have about 400 or 500 million in a few years because it was just the economics. I thought that the 5-6 billion market cap, the after-tax earnings would be more than 5-6 billion, just based on what was going on here. And we had a star manager who was really good, and we had these different franchises. And they took, one of my big regrets is I owned about close to 1%, around 1% of Fiat Chrysler when we made that investment, about 60 million, or about 5-6 billion. It was about 1%. We owned about 0.7 or 0.8% of Ferrari. They owned 80% of Ferrari, so about close to 1% of Ferrari was owned by me. Ferrari's market cap now is about 50 billion. And, they went public, I think, in 2017 or something, 2017, 2018, they IPO'd Ferrari. And, in effect, out of the 60 million, 20 million had been invested in Ferrari. So I collected around 150 million from that. But what I should have done, which I never realized, is I didn't realize the quality of the business, is that should never have been sold. And I got to know the chairman, the owners of Ferrari. I went and visited the factory, and they also let me bump the queue, and I got a 488 in 2018, which was great. And that's when I really realized it was a tremendous moat. But anyway, so just Ferrari alone, out of that 60 million, 20 million is Ferrari, is about 400 million. That's a 20x. And the 40 million that went into Fiat would today be sitting at around 200 million or so. So basically, I don't have a position in any of these things now. Collectively, I collected about 250 million on this, which was still okay. But it was stupid. The whole thing was stupid. The sell decision was sloppy. So old too soon and wise too late. And so what I realized is that do not be quick to sell. Like I told myself that Reysas in the 2040s, we look at what to do with it. With TAV Airports, maybe into the 2050s, if I'm still around, we'll see what we want to do with it. They'll probably keep adding an airport every year or two, and they'll keep the passenger counts keep going up, and all of that. Is just a great business. So we are at 5:30.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Maybe just one Rakesh, can you discuss a little bit your Dakshana Foundation? Warren Buffett said that your annual report is much better than this. That is your charitable foundation that you started.
We should not believe everything Buffett says. Sometimes he just makes us feel good. But Warren actually, what has surprised me is he reads the Dakshana annual report every year when I send it to him. Sometimes he'll tell me, send me 20 copies, and he'll send it to his kids and his board members and his friends and so on. So there have been 2 or 3 things that I think have been, so I'll take a step back. I think you guys have heard of Peter Thiel. Some of you may have heard of or read his book, 0 to 1, which is a great book on entrepreneurship and startups and so on. One of the questions Peter Thiel asks in interviews, he says, what is the one truth that you know to be true that most of the world disagrees with you on? Right? And so this is, if you ever go in front of Peter Thiel now, you already know the question. So please prepare so you don't blow the question, okay? And this is a great question, right? And if he asked me that question, I would say the mental model of cloning. So people think cloning is somehow like copying and it's beneath them and whatever, and they want to come up with things on their own. It's very dumb. I would say that let's leverage all the great giants who have come before us. Let's stand on their shoulders and let's go as far as we can by being on their shoulders. Let's not try to rise on our own because that's really hard. So what I have noticed through the decades that I've tried to do this is that humans have, I don't know why, but humans have an aversion to cloning. And once I realized that humans have an aversion to cloning, just like they have an aversion to buying Turkish stocks, I realized that you get irrational behavior when you have these aversions. So go all in on those because you're going to have some good advantages. And cloning has helped me a lot in many different areas. So Dakshana has done well because it is a cloned model. So in 2006, I was reading an article on Business Week. There's a guy in India who runs an organization called Super 30. And he takes 30 really poor kids who are like 18 years old. And he's a gifted mathematician. And he preps them for about 10 months. So he basically operates out of a slum in Patna in Bihar, which is a pretty desolate place. I visited him there in 2007. And he would take these, so he had a kind of a coaching, tutoring business, and he would take some of the proceeds from that to fund these 30 kids. So his mother would cook for them, and then he'd rent a few rooms in that slum for the kids, so they lived there. And then after about 10 months of prep, they would take the IIT entrance exam, which has a 1.3% admission rate. And between 90 and 100% of the kids would get into IIT, which is a stunning statistic. And these kids came from really poor backgrounds. They had illiterate parents, farmers, laborers, so on. They were very poor. And so when I looked at that model, I said, wow, this is just, he was spending about $800 per kid. And I said, that's tremendous bang for the buck, because once you get out of IIT, Microsoft's willing to hire you. You pretty much can join a global workforce. So I contacted him, went and met him, and I said, happy to fund you. Can we take 30 to 300? And he said, I have no interest in scaling. I don't want any outside money. I like it the way it is. So then I knew that cloning works well. I said, do you mind if I copy your model? He said, no, that'll be a really good thing. I'll help you. And so I said, okay, I know what his model is. I know that there's a large need. And so now Dakshana takes about 1,000 kids a year. And we're not doing 90%. We're probably in kind of 60 to 80% admit rates. And it's worked out really well. And our costs are not 800, it's about 3,000, because we're not operating with my mom cooking or whatever. So we've got a little more industrial scale to it. And Warren actually has seen that journey, because when I met him for lunch, the first Dakshana annual report had just come out and I had sent it to him. And so the input-output ratio we have on Dakshana is really kind of infinite. Like recently I was there's a girl who was with us from 2010 to 2012, and then she joined IIT Guwahati in 2012, math major. She finished in 2016. Goldman Sachs recruited her, their Bangalore office. She worked there till 2019 as an analyst, and then she started a PhD program at Stony Brook University, which is where all the quant mathematicians are. And like the Stony Brook is kind of the epicenter of the quant funds, Renaissance is there and all of these things. And she's been interning at a quant fund there for the last 3 years. She's going to graduate in May. And I think she'll be heavily recruited. And, she came from a family making like, $75, $80 a month. And she may be 7 figures when she starts. So it's just a huge delta. And so we only invested less than 3,000 in her, and if you take us out of the picture, because she came from such a remote rural area, these things wouldn't happen, and so it's worked out really well. So the reason Dakshana has done well and why I look good is we cloned a great model, and I lucked out, I got a great team in India. So I don't actually spend a lot of time on the foundation. I enjoy my visits, but I usually just spend time with the kids. And I still enjoy the Istanbul visits, so I have to balance the two. But thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Good luck with your stock picking, and try to focus on the cloning. Look at Dataroma, look at Value Investors Club, look at what other smart people are saying, and try to find some anomalies and go from there.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Here's a small memory of your practice. That was very inspiring. Thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us today. And we hope to continue the collaboration in the future.
Yeah, I'm right in your backyard. So it's easy to do. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so
Okay.
much. No, that was...